Michael Birch is the Director of the Australian College of Trauma Treatment. He has over 35 years in psychology counselling, education and training. He's worked clinically in the area of post-traumatic stress disorder for 30 years, and he was responsible for setting up and supervising trauma response teams of psychologists through much of country Victoria to help veterans and their families. Michael has published and presented nationally and internationally in the field of post-traumatic stress. In 2010, he was made a Fellow of the Australian Psychological Society, and he's been awarded the Order of Australia Medal. Michael joins us today to discuss the psychological impact of cancel culture and the restriction of freedom and freedom of speech and what it's doing to us in this current COVID climate. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you very much, Michael and George, for inviting me on the program today. I've been really looking forward to it and delighted to contribute.
Great to have you. Now, since COVID began, we've seen a noticeable divide in Australia and globally as far as the need to attack and cancel other people's freedom of speech and opinions. Do you think that's playing into our psychological trauma?
Oh, absolutely, Michael. Look, I've just noticed so many issues develop within my clients around that. They become more anxious and more depressed if they suffer from post-traumatic stress, especially when it comes to adult survivors of abuse and survivors of the Holocaust. They become very, very anxious and fearful. And I think the shaming and the limitation on different points of view being allowed to be committed in society is part of that problem. I know, for example, my Holocaust survivors that I work with keep telling me they're reminded about some of their experiences, some of their parents' experiences had in Germany, in the way in which information was controlled and information was manipulated through programs like Goebbels and so forth. I know that might be part of their problem, but gee, I mean, that's just an example of how certain groups can really be affected by this type of scenario where information is limited. Look, and I do know the justification sometimes. I mean, when people, perhaps like my clients or others, want to hear different scientific points of view, they are often shamed and blamed and gaslighted, which is part of trauma, by the way. They experience that, and they experience that in society in general. But in fact, while there are, from a broader psychosocial perspective, from the area of philosophy, I mean, while there are conspiracy theorists around that are quite delusional, after all, there are great historical figures like Einstein, who was accused of being a conspiracy theorist by the Nazis. There was Copernicus, who was also accused of being a heretic, and of course, one of the founders of Western philosophy, Socrates, was accused also of being a conspiracy theorist or heretic. So seeing all this sort of situation around us by certain members of our society, especially those suffering from mental health issues, just inflames their issues. It makes them worried and I think far more damaged. And I don't think it's a great thing for society in general. People that perhaps don't have issues can develop issues from this confusing scenario.
We're hardwired to want to belong, because to be driven out of a tribe back in the old days would basically bring about your demise. So how does that play into it?
Well, that's quite right, Michael. We're hardwired. It's innate for us to be have tribal allegiances. It's innate for us to have some kind of inbuilt moral value. But that can be very much manipulated by what goes on in society, what is the predominant ideology. So if we're not careful, we can steer more and more towards that tribal in-out type behaviour where we're against each other. I'm sort of reflecting, I've been around for a while. I was reflecting on my training in the late 70s and early 80s in philosophy and psychology and also especially the media at Swinburne University. And at that time, we used to actually take turns of adopting different views and different perspectives, different political views. And there's always the respect, if you like, the understanding that we respect different views. The idea that was around a lot following World War II, that especially that I may disagree with you, but I'll fight to the death to defend you. What I've seen, unfortunately, gravitate over the last 35 years or so, or 30 years, is that if you don't agree with me, I'll make sure that I punish you and contempt you. And that seems to be, unfortunately, very much propagated by dominant ideologies, which is not a great thing for a healthy society or the psychology well-being of the individual, indeed.
How do you think social media played into this? Because it definitely seems magnified on some of the platforms. I'm of value, you're worthless, your opinion is bad, my opinion is good, and the algorithms that play into it that actually enforce, well, I must be right because I'm getting all this reassurance and reaffirmation that my perspective is right. How do you think that's harming us?
I think the with the social media, it's a double-edged sword. I think that allows many extreme groups to pretend they represent the majority of Australians, or the majority of the people in a particular nation, and then try and use that, if you like, that group think, or that type of control to make people feel as though they're on the outer, that they're somehow silly or an idiot. But on the other hand, the social media networks, depending on which ones you go to, the platforms provide great scientific data and information that is not necessarily available in the mainstream. So it's a double-edged sword, I think, but it can be great for information, but it also can be a plague, so to speak.
What about the phenomenon of toxic positivity, where we're just seeing people that, we're in this, we'll get through this, we're great? How does that affect people when they actually aren't feeling it? Is it helpful to tell someone, you should be all right, don't worry about it, you've got plenty to be grateful for? How do we approach people who may be struggling?
Well, I don't think that's particularly helpful. The message there is that if you're suffering as an individual, it doesn't really matter. It'll be okay in the end. Just trust us. But if that trust has been compromised, if there's confusing messages, or there's if you like, poor leadership, or shame or criticism for having your own thoughts or your own rationale or your own political perspective, that doesn't help at all. That makes people feel more conflicted psychologically and more confused, and if you like, they're going to experience that more as gaslighting, if I can explain it that way. That they actually feel like they're blamed or made to feel silly for having their own ways of reasoning or their own way of thinking. I don't think that's particularly helpful.
So how should we approach, Michael, what's the best way we can help our friends?
Well, I think one of the things that I have noticed in the many years working in this field, in psychology and to some extent politics, is that what helps people is that you mentioned toxic positivity. It is, in a sense, manipulation. What helps people is to, if you like, decode how in which that manipulation is being propagated. When they understand that these, if you like, there are certain agendas or certain strategies that are being employed, and there's probably not the scope to go into this now. We could talk about the way in which, if you like, complementary roles or non-verbal language is used to try and control people. But on an individual basis, when I make clients and groups aware of this codification, they can actually break that code and feel more liberated. For example, it's being talked a lot now about gaslighting and Stockholming. That wasn't in the language so much 20 years ago. Now it's being applied to positive toxicity, that people understand that when they're being told to think a certain way, when they're told to not think a certain way, or to inquire or look for different perspectives, they understand that potentially can be a phenomenon of gaslighting, being that if they object, they're criticised, and if they complain about being criticised, they're criticised again. So when they understand that, that is very helpful to break that code. Now, I first worked that out, and just how that was so helpful was debriefing former intelligence officers. When I was working in under the umbrella of Veterans Affairs and so forth, we'd see different ex-operatives come through, and they would do a great job in their particular operation, but they needed to be debriefed. So, working through that, if you like, that initial programming, how to decode that, then to, if you like, integrate into normal life was part of that training. I apply that now to help people individually and also in various media outlets. But it's a whole program in itself, how that is actually orchestrated.
If somebody is feeling psychologically unsafe, their physiological response is the same as if they're physically unsafe. We have the adrenaline, the cortisol, the downstairs part of the brain starting to work. So
that's right. If there's a strong, you can look at trauma. You can go into the trauma frameworks now. People can suffer physical assault, sexual assault. They can suffer childhood abuse, and there's a whole impact on the, if you like, the limbic system, the neuropsychological system. But also you can look at studies around bullying and trauma. And there's a lot of studies now that show there can be a parallel between actual abuse and verbal abuse of some kind or another. And you could actually apply that on a mass scale also. So all in all, best not to abuse people, best not to psychologically assault people, best to develop messages that work for all the population, for the entire nation, not just set one group against the other, not create one tribe against the other. That doesn't work. All we have to do is look at past examples, past great leaders. Winston Churchill, for example, through World War II, he would develop language and styles that inspired the entire nation. Now we're sort of working on the lines of tribalisation, unfortunately, in many cases where we're setting one group against the other. How can we overcome a common national emergency when that's going on? We can't. Let's look at those great figures from the past and develop some strategies around what's worked, how we go about that now.
There you have it, folks. What a brilliant way to close with some pertinent and great advice there from Michael Burge. Years of experience in the field. I think it basically boiled down to just be kind and don't be a dick.
You've got it there. I agree with that.
Thank you, Michael. Great to have you.
My pleasure.